Hi people, this is Daniel from Devil & Sons Guitars here, and today I'm going to talk about the thing that's been most requested in the comments on my YouTube video, and that is how to set up your guitar. As this is such a requested video, I'm going to go into as much detail as possible. I'm going to start by talking about the tools you need to set up your video, then I'm going to talk about how to string your guitar, how to adjust the truss rod, how to set up the string height, or what we might call the action, then to think about intonation. Then finally, something that a lot of people miss out of their setups, which is how to adjust the pickup height. The height of the pickups in relation to the string is really important for getting a good sound. What I'm going to ask is, if you're watching this video and you've got any other tips or advice that augment what I'm saying, please leave it in the comments. And if you're watching this video, go back and look over the comments that other people have left, because they might be useful. If they are, give them a thumbs up, give them a like, leave them a comment. And if you found this video useful yourself, please leave me a comment and a thumbs up and a subscription. Although I'm talking about the things in a systematic order, it is important to note that things are connected and sometimes you might go backwards and forwards. So if you only watch one particular section but you find it useful, it may be worth going back and watching the whole video. So with no further ado, I'm going to get my guitar and then we go forward with the setup. The guitar I'm using for this video is a Les Paul style one with a tune-o-matic bridge. It's called the Intonation 2, I've just finished it for Dr. Gothic. Because it's a tune-o-matic style bridge, it's set up like most Les Pauls. The way you set up a bridge is very similar for all guitars, but obviously there'll be variations depending on how the bridge works. So I've made a series of other videos focusing on different styles of bridges, which I'll keep adding to, so if you do subscribe you'll see them as they come up in the feed. So let's have a look at the tools that we need for the setup process. I've divided them into sections. Each one's got the link above it that tells you what point in the video I'm going to focus on that particular section of the setup. Although all the bits link together, so sometimes you might jump backwards and forwards between certain sections. Clearly though, the most important tool that you need is your cup of tea. Right, so the first things we're going to look at is putting your strings on. For that, really, all you need is wire clippers to cut the strings, but I also use a string winder here. So I've got my string winder attachment that goes around the machine head. It fits quite neatly into my drill, my screwdriver. Screwdriver's great here because it can go quite slow, or it can speed up. You don't really need a string winder. I find it does save me time because I do a lot of taking strings on and off. It came with this little attachment that goes in and then you can hand wind it. Does save time, I would recommend one, but not essential at all. So then, after we have put the strings on, the first thing we will do is check the truss rod. So to check the truss rod, you're going to need a capo. I've got one like this. Obviously they come in lots of different types. The capo is quite important for that. Got a screwdriver handy to remove the truss rod cover. And then what you're going to need to adjust the truss rod is some sort of Allen wrench or Allen key. Most guitars will come with something like this in the pack when you buy them new. I've got a longer one here which I find is much easier for access. As I'll mention in the truss rod section, some truss rods don't use Allen keys, Allen wrenches. I've also got a part of a feeler gauge here which I use to check the string height when adjusting the truss rod, so only for the truss rod adjustment. It's one that I've taken and bent so I can hook it over the top of the guitar. Feeler gauges normally come in sections like this, packs like this, a bit like a Swiss Army knife. Each one of these pieces of metal is a slightly different thickness, so it's got the sizes written on it. The one that I tend to use is this, 0.015 or 0.381 millimeters. Some people might use a slightly thinner one, a 0.010 instead of a 0.015, but I like the 0.015. Then we've got adjusting the string height. Now, adjusting the string height is done by adjusting the saddles. I've made a series of videos on different saddles, and I'll keep adding more videos to that series because the saddles are all adjusted differently, but essentially it's the same process you use to change the string height, even if it's done differently on the different bridges. So what you will definitely need is a ruler, or I'm using a string gauge, which has got the measurements on it that tell us the height of the string. I'll focus more on that in the string section, string height section. But then for most guitars, probably to move the saddles, you're going to need either an Allen key. I've got a small one here. I've also got one which is more like a screwdriver, which I find really useful to use. For the guitar that I'm using, it's a Tune-o-matic style bridge, and I'm actually going to use a flathead screwdriver. Doesn't need the Allen keys. Right, once we've done that, we're on to the intonation. The most important thing about the intonation is moving the saddle backwards and forwards. Again, different saddles work in different ways, different bridges have different saddles. Sometimes you might use an Allen key, but quite often you might use a screwdriver, as is the case for this one. So for the Tune-o-matic, again, I've got a flathead screwdriver which I'm going to use. I've also got plectrum, always useful for strumming the strings. There's some other things we need, and they're to do with the setup space. Having a fancy setup space isn't essential, but it is helpful. Some people just have a table with some towels on to stop their guitar getting scratched. I've got a padded area with these extra pads that I can put the guitar body on, so it's raised up off of the table, so if the neck has an angled headstock, the headstock isn't touching the table and applying pressure to the neck. Then my tools are handy with my tuner, my amp. I'm going to go over the tools in a moment, but I'm also going to make a separate video about this setup area and the magnetic strips and things that are on it, everything that's useful, in a separate video, so do subscribe to see that when it comes out. I'm going to start with the lower E string, although this is the same process for all the strings. I've already threaded it through the bridge, put it over the saddle, and now I've brought it up to the nut here. It fits through the slot on the nut, and then it's going to go into this tuning peg. So obviously, depending on the guitar you've got, depend how your tuning pegs are laid out. This one, Les Paul style, 3 top, 3 on the bottom. What you need to do, no matter what type of guitar you have and what type of headstock it is, you want to cut the string so that it's not too long, otherwise you're just going to have too much going round and round the tuning peg, which isn't really good for the tuning peg, and is a bit of a waste of time for you for tuning. Basically what you're going to aim for is to have the string extended beyond the tuning peg it's going into, roughly 1.5 spaces between the tuning pegs. So for example, here it's really easy to measure because it's the first one. I'm going to cut it halfway between this and this tuning peg here. So that will give it a 1.5 spaces length extra on the string. If I was here, if I was putting it into this tuning peg, if it was the D string, then I would go roughly about here to cut it. You could probably get away with just 1 space longer, but I like to do a space and a half. So here we go, I'm going to cut the string. Now I'm going to turn the tuning peg so that the hole in the tuning peg is in line with the direction the string's going to go in. Just like this, so it goes straight through. Now we're looking at an angle more or less from the body of the guitar up the neck. I'm going to pull the string back towards the bridge, so only a little bit is going through the actual hole on the tuning peg. And then I'm going to start turning the tuning peg. Now I'm using a string winder to help me here. I'm going to make sure there's not too much going through, I don't want it too long. Now here it is, it's come round, so the bit that's pointing through the tuning peg is pointing back at the guitar. And what I'm going to try and do, whilst pulling the string back towards the bridge so it's tight, so I'm using my finger here to push down, and I want my string to go under that bit that's going through the tuning peg. So the bit that goes through the tuning peg winds round over the string that's coming back to the body. I'm still pulling up on the string now to give it a bit more tightness. I'm not going too fast, but this time I'm going to make my string go over the bit that's sticking through the peg. And now it's through, I'm going to push it back down again. So it's a bit like it's sandwiching the string between the two parts. You can just about see here the string coming through the tuning peg, and there's one bit of string going underneath it and one bit of string going above it. Now as I carry on winding, I'm going to go back underneath it. I've got to be careful not to get my finger stuck. In fact, this one doesn't need to go far enough to go underneath it again. And that will help stop the string slide. I'm going to do that all again now, but from a different angle with the 5th string so you can see what's happening. Threading it through the bridge, over the saddle, along the nut, to the peg that it's going to go into, but then I'm going to leave it an extra 1.5 spaces, so about there is where I'll cut it. Like I said before, you really can get away with just one. Then I'm going to turn the tuning peg so the hole is in line with the string coming along the body, over the nut, into the hole. And I can pull it through. Then I'm going to pull it back so only a small amount is coming through the end of there. Then using the string winder, I can wind the string. Now while I'm doing that, I'm pulling back on the string towards the bridge to apply tension to it. At all costs, you want this as tight as you can at this point. As soon as you start to get slack here, the string starts to unwind a bit and it doesn't grip as tight. So I'm applying pressure, pulling it back. Now it's just turned at a slight angle. It's not coming back through the hole in the tuning peg. There's enough tension there to hold it in place. So pulling it back. This time I'm pushing the string down. So I'm going to move my finger closer to the end, pushing it down so the part of the string that's coming through the hole of the tuning peg is going over the string that's going along the body. And still with my hand here, I'm pulling back on the string to give it tension. There we go. Now that the string has gone, the bit that's gone through the hole is gone over the top of the string that's going along the body, I'm going to pull this string up so it's applying tension to the bottom of the string, the part that's going through the hole. I hope this makes sense. And I'll keep turning. As it comes back around now, I'm going to push down. So now the bit that's gone through the tuning peg, on the first loop round, it went above the main string. Now it's gone under the main string. The main string's now pushing down on top of it to sandwich it tightly between the first and the second loop on the shaft of the tuning peg. Now I'm pulling my hand back so I don't get my finger stuck here. I'm still applying tension on this string by lifting it up from the body. And this time I'm going to go back under it, under the loop that came through. Let's go back the other way a bit. There we go. And then I can pull it tight. Now one thing to think about when you're turning the tuning pegs is which direction to turn them in to attach the strings. You want to think about it in relation to how the strings come over the nut, across the headstock, and so that they don't interfere with each other. So here, for the tuning pegs on the top of the guitar headstock, I've turned them away from the body to tighten the strings. That's meant the strings come over the nut into the shaft of the tuning peg, and when it's been turned away, it's caused the string to loop around the tuning peg this way. So the string is on the bottom side of the tuning peg as it tightens. If I turned it the other way, it would have gone along the top side of the tuning peg. Now first of all, that would have looked uglier here, but if you can imagine it going on the top side of this tuning peg, it would have actually caught onto this tuning peg first. So they need to turn away to make sure they go along the bottom. Basically, when you've got your tuning pegs on the top of a guitar, probably you're going to be wanting to turn them away from the body to tighten it. So if you've got all your 6 in line on the top of your headstock, Fender style, then you'll be wanting to turn it away. When we go to the bottom strings, it's a bit different here. If I give you an example, I'm using the offcut of the E string just to make it easier to see. If I were to slot it through the hole here, if I'm to turn the string away from the guitar, let's keep it in position on that, you'll see that it starts to go around the bottom of the tuning peg, which will mean it's pulling away like this, which I think will look ugly. On some guitars it might actually go over that offcut there, it means you'll get caught. But if you imagine that now on this string, the middle one, coming away, let's do it this way around, it would actually catch on this tuning peg before it even gets back to the nut, which would mean that as you're tightening this, there's a risk that the string would get caught here. You'll be tightening it in it just between this gap, just stretching this part of the string and therefore breaking the string. So you always want to think carefully about where it's going, and as a rule of thumb, normally if the tuning peg's on the top side of the headstock, you're turning away, and if on the bottom side, you're turning towards the body. I've got all 6 strings on now, so one thing that's good to do before we carry on to the next stages is give each string a bit of a pre-stretch. So at this point I'm plugging the guitar in. You don't need the guitar plugged in for this, but before we go into the next stage, which is adjusting the truss rod, I'm just going to pluck the strings to demonstrate a problem with the neck. So here, if I pluck the open E, it's fine. Now, here we are on the G. It seems to be hitting against the neck somewhere, and if I go onto the B, it's really muted. Now let me just demonstrate. If I keep playing the B but bend the neck up slightly and then release it, as I bend it up, so I'm bending the front of the neck up, keeping the back where it is, so bowing the neck slightly, what's happening is the B string is no longer touching against all the frets. When it's touching against the frets, it's causing this noise. And when I bend it up, it's not. Now that could be the truss rod adjusting, could be some other things, for example the height of the strings, or even that these pickups are set quite high at the moment and they could be touching against the strings. So I'm going to do a quick visual check to check that the pickups and nothing else are getting in the way of the strings when they're playing. You can see that there is definitely a gap between the strings and the pickups, which is bigger than the gap between the strings and the fretboard. So if I just pluck a string, I'll pluck the E string. It's not in any way interfering with the pickup, and if I pluck the B string, well, we can hear the B string is still touching something, but it's not the pickup, so it must be the frets. Now let me give you one quick explanation of how the truss rod works by drawing a picture of the neck from the side on. So it's a very basic drawing I'm doing here of a neck. The neck going into the heel. So this is the headstock end where our strings would go through. And there's our little nut, then it will go across with all the frets as it comes into the heel, into the body of the guitar here. So there's the body of the guitar. I'm going to draw in blue the truss rod. Basically under the fretboard in the neck there is a recessed, a hollowed out bit where your truss rod will go. I'm going to draw my truss rod as a blue line here. Not very neat. For most guitars the truss rod is anchored at one end, which means it's fixed at one end. The guitar I'm showing you, it's fixed at this end here, and we access the truss rod through the headstock. Some guitars will have a space here where you can access the truss rod from the body and it will be fixed and anchored at the headstock end. Some truss rods you can adjust from both ends, but for now I want you to imagine that the truss rod is actually one very long bolt. It's not actually exactly that, but imagine it's one very long bolt. At one end of the bolt it's stuck in the neck, the other end of the bolt there is a nut. As we turn the truss rod, it's going to turn in the nut, and the nut is fixed in the neck. So if you can imagine turning the bolt so that the nut is getting further down the bolt, further towards this end, what that would cause is compression of the wood as the length between this nut and the fixed part gets smaller. It's making the neck compress. If we were to turn it the other way, so the gap between this nut and the anchored end extends, then what we're doing is we're stretching the wood a bit. Now if I give you a quick cross section looking from the top of the guitar neck, the neck's this shape with the truss rod going through it. It's flat on top, that's where the fingerboard is, with the strings going over them. And we've got the shape of your neck, a D or a C or however you have it. Now what's going to happen as this compresses, as we tighten the truss rod, so the gap between the anchor and the nut get tighter, as it compresses the wood is going to compress, and as you can see above the truss rod there's much more wood than below the truss rod, and that means the wood below the truss rod is going to compress easier than the one along the top because there's less of it. So as you tighten your truss rod, what happens is the bottom of the wood compresses more than the top does, and it causes your neck to bend like this. Now, I might be exaggerating there, the bend, but that's what happens when you compress it. That's what we might call giving your neck a back bow. If you loosened it, what might happen is your neck would become bowed this way instead, because the gap between the nut and the anchor is being pushed aside. If you can imagine this bow and how it would interfere with your strings. So let's just imagine this back bow like that on your neck. I'll draw the blue strings going over the top of your guitar. Well, look, the strings going over the guitar from the bridge to the tuners on the headstock is now touching or being pushed against the bow because the bow's too high. If the back bow's too high, so it's touching. If it was too low, if the bow was like this, we'd get more space between the necks. Now what I've done on this guitar is deliberately set up the guitar slightly wrong, so we have got some of the strings catching on the neck, and I'm going to have to turn the truss rod to give it some relief to let those strings be free. As much as possible you want the neck to be more or less flat. In fact, you actually don't want it completely flat, you really want it with a bit of a back bow. Let's go ahead and see how it works in real life. So going forward, a lot of the things we're going to do are much easier with the guitar in the upright position. You could do it flat, but ideally you want to do as much as you can in the upright position. So here we go. What we're going to do is check the truss rod. Now to do that, we're thinking just about the truss rod in the neck, not its relationship at the moment to the bridge. So we're going to completely ignore the bridge, and the way we're going to do that is take a capo, put it on the first fret. So now we've got the strings held down at the first fret, and then with one hand we're going to hold the string one at a time at roughly the fret where it meets the body, so around here. Now what we're doing is we're looking at the string between the first fret and this fret, and the relationship between the string and the neck, totally irrelevant of where the string's coming from the bridge, because I'm holding it down at this fret. So it's just looking at the string in relation to the neck along this part of the neck. And the way we're going to check to see what it looks like is by using the feeler gauge, which I'm going to put in around halfway at fret 7, and I'm going to push it down. And what I can see is as I push it down, there's not a big enough gap between the string and the fret. The fret is more or less touching the string, so as I put the feeler gauge in, it pushes the string away. We'll look at that from another angle in a minute. I always normally check first of all the 6th string and then the top string, the 1st string, and if it's a problem at the bottom string, yeah, it's a problem at the top string as well. So here it is from another angle. The capo is on the 1st fret, my finger is holding down the string, the 6th string, at the point where the guitar neck reaches the body, and then I'm going to use the feeler gauge here to just push under the string, and what you'll see is the string raises up, and that's because there isn't a gap between the fret and the string which is big enough. Now if you remember, I'm using a 0.15 or a 0.381mm feeler gauge. That's the guideline I like to use. Some people might like something a bit smaller or a bit bigger. It's a matter of taste, but I would recommend this. So how do we make the change? Well, we need to adjust the truss rod. On this guitar, the truss rod is accessed underneath the truss rod cover at the top of the neck. Now that's quite a common place to access the truss rod. Some guitars might have an access at the other end. Truss rods can be quite different sizes, but essentially it's the same process you're going through. Now some people like to loosen the strings a bit whilst they're adjusting the truss rod. Now when you adjust the truss rod, it's essentially going to put pressure on or relieve pressure from the strings depending on which way you're turning the truss rod. Obviously if you're applying pressure on the strings, you're stretching them further, and when you stretch them further it could cause the string to break. But really you're not changing it much more than just changing the tuning pegs. So if your strings are a little bit loose like mine are, it should be absolutely fine not to loosen the strings between each turn of the truss rod. Now the cover's removed, you can see the gap here where we access the truss rod, and if I shine a light in, you can just about see that the end of the truss rod takes an Allen key. In this case it's a 4mm Allen key. Most guitars you're probably going to find take Allen keys, wrench keys. Some might be a screwdriver, they're all a bit different, but most of them would be something like this. And most guitars will come with the correct Allen key to adjust the truss rod. Now I'm back in the playing position, so I'll put my Allen key into the truss rod. With a guitar like this where the tuning pegs are on the top and the bottom of the headstock, it leaves a nice little gap for the tuning peg for the Allen key to easily go into the truss rod. With a guitar maybe where the headstock has all the machine heads on one side, the top or the bottom, you might find the middle strings get in the way of your access to the truss rod. So what you might have to do is loosen those strings a bit to pull them aside and make a bit more of a gap. What I'm focusing on is the lower E and the top E to check them in relationship to the neck. So again, I've got the capo on, I can use my finger to hold down the fret just where it reaches the body. My feeler gauge, I'll just check at the 7th fret. Yeah, so the 7th fret, when I put the feeler gauge in, it's pushing the string up because the gap's not big enough. So what I'm going to do is try tightening the truss rod, just turning it a little bit at a time. Like I said, I'm not too worried about breaking a string because there's still enough tension left in the strings, enough give left in the strings. They're not that tight. Let's have another check. Yeah, there's still a bit too tight a gap. It's quite hard to break a truss rod, so you can keep turning. Oh yeah, that feels like it's getting there. It's still pushing it away a bit. Give it a bigger turn. It's quite hard to do whilst filming. Okay, I'm getting there. There, right, I'm able to slide my feeler gauge under the string and it's barely touching the string, but it is slightly, so I'm going to give it a bit more of a turn, a very slight more turn. There you go. I don't think that's really touching. Let's just check with the top E. Yeah, that's free to slide. Sometimes to check, I put it between the 6th and 7th frets and then push my feeler gauge over the fret and I can see if it's lifting the string or not. Yep, I'm happy with that. Now I should find when I take the capo off and play the strings one at a time, none of them are rubbing against the frets. They're clearly not in tune, but they're not rubbing against the frets because the angle of the neck is now correct. Now I'm not going to screw the truss rod back on just yet because there's still a possibility I might adjust the truss rod slightly after I've adjusted the string height and the intonation, but I'll come back to that later. So we've reached about halfway through the setup. I've got some tips and advice to give you, but first of all at this point it might be worth having a break for a cup of tea. Great. So a few things to think about going forward. Firstly is when you're stringing your guitar, you want to tune your guitar to how you would normally have it tuned. So if you're with a standard tuning, great. If you play with a drop C, for example, tune it like that throughout the setup. Play it as you normally would when you're setting it up. So keep your guitar in the upright playing position. Play it with a plectrum or your fingers, whatever you would normally play with a sort of strength you might normally, so you can see that as the strings vibrate, they're not getting in the way of anything such as the pickups, etc. Anyway, I hope this will all make sense as you're going forward. There are a few things that are standard for every guitar and always right or wrong, and that's the intonation, for example. But other things are a matter of taste. The string height might change depending on the way you play, the style you're playing. Maybe on different guitars you have different string height as well. So as you set up your guitars, you'll get used to what you want and you may come back and change. Please leave in the comments below any advice you have about the way you set up your guitar. Things like that are useful for other viewers, so make sure you read other comments. Leave a like if you like their comments, like this video if you like it, subscribe. I've got more videos coming where I'm going to cover certain things that are in this video in a lot more detail, and there are some things that I'm missing out of this video, such as the nut height and the break angle of the neck, which are much more advanced and you probably won't need in a setup. And also changing, for example, the nut height could be something that's irreversible, so we don't really want to mention that now until we're a bit more confident with how to do it. So let's get on with setting up the guitar. The next thing to do is set up the string height. It's easier to do in the playing position, but it's easier to film with the guitar like it is on the setup table. I am aiming for the 12th fret here for the string height of the lower E to be 2mm. So 2mm off of the top of the fret. This string gauge I'm using has got these black marks which show the different heights, different gaps. At the moment, I think this 6th string is a little bit low for me, because the gap between the top of the fret and the underside of the string should be that 2mm black rectangle, and it's maybe slightly too low. You could do this with a ruler, but as you can see with a ruler, the problem is there's a tendency it could wobble a bit and it's harder to read, whereas with the string gauge, because it rests across a number of frets, it's much more stable. The other thing to note about string height is it is very much your own taste. Some people prefer their actions higher than others. I, for example, well, I mainly play bass, but I have the action higher on certain basses than others, just because the thicknesses of the neck are different, and possibly sometimes I play slightly different styles on them, and sometimes I prefer a higher action. But it's a matter of taste. I tend to set up all my guitars when they come out of the workshop at 2mm for the 6th and the 5th string, the E and the A, 1.5mm for the middle strings, the D and the G, and then the top strings, the B and the E, to be 1mm. To adjust the height of strings, you need to adjust them at the bridge. So you normally would either adjust the saddle or the bridge itself. And on this guitar, which has a Gibson style tunematic bridge, you can adjust the height of the strings by turning the screws at each end of the bridge. Essentially, you can make each side higher or lower, and you can adjust them independently. So this side could go higher whilst this one goes lower, or vice versa, or both higher, both lower. What it means is you can't individually change the height of each saddle. You change the height or the angle of the height of the bridge, so then they all change at the same time. Whereas on, for example, a Fender Strat style bridge, you'd be able to adjust each saddle independently with its own Allen keys. So because there's such a range of differences in the way bridges work, I'm making a whole series of other videos introducing each type of bridge and how it works in more detail. But essentially what you're doing is raising or lowering the string height at the bridge by making the saddle higher or lower. In this case, as I want to make the string higher on this side, I'm going to turn it, make it very slightly higher, and then go back to measure. The string height is now correct on this guitar, so that the lower E is 2mm off of the top of the fret at the 12th fret, and the top E 1mm off of the fret. What I'm going to do now is tune the guitar up, E, A, D, G, B, E. However you want your tuning though, you might have it differently for most of your playing. Tune it to how you would normally play. Then we're going to set the intonation. Now just quickly, obviously, the way you tune your guitar is by you're playing each string individually. So here the lower E string, I'm going to turn the machine head, making the string tighter, makes the note higher, and making it lower. Sorry, releasing the tightness of the string makes the note lower. You can see my chord pitch black just out of focus there in the background. So I'm going to quickly tune my guitar so it's roughly correct. So at this point with new strings, I would normally give them a stretch again like I did when I first put them on, and then retune it one more time before going on to set the intonation. So what I'm doing here, the video is sped up, but essentially I'm playing each string one at a time, working from the low E to the top E, checking it's roughly in tune, and then going over it again. So I've gone over it a few times before setting the intonation. Now when we talk about intonation, we're basically checking that the guitar stays in tune at all points along the fretboard. So the best way to do that is to play an open note and then fret that note at the 12th fret, so you're playing the octave of it. Now you could do that, you could play at the 1st fret and then you could jump up to the 13th fret, check the octave. What we can see here is this E is at the moment the open and the octave aren't quite in tune. Now I've actually got my guitar going through the tuner still, so I can visually see this. The way we make them in tune to set up the intonation correctly is play the open note and tune it so it's exactly as it should be. So my bass E string, just tuning it here. My tuner says that's in tune. Now I'm going to play the 12th fret, and it's actually slightly sharp. Ideally you should do this in the playing position, but for filming it, it's much easier for me to do it like this. It's actually harder to play it like this though. So it's slightly sharp. So because it's slightly sharp, it means I need to make the string slightly longer by moving this saddle backwards. Now, again, each bridge has a different way of moving the saddles. I've made those videos about other types of bridges, but for the Tune-O-Matic style bridge, it has a screw here, which when you turn it moves the saddle backwards and forwards. Now, as I'm about to make the saddle go backwards and the string a bit longer, it's actually going to put a bit of tension on the string. So I'm going to detune it slightly, make it a bit looser, while I extend the saddle into the back position. Again, ideally you do this in the playing position. Alright, let's go forward, here we go. I'm lifting the string slightly so the saddle doesn't just rub across the string when I'm doing it. Now that might be too much. Let's play it open again. Again, my tuner says that's in tune. Fret it at the 12th fret. So there we go. So what I'm going to do is do that for all the strings to check that both open and at the 12th fret they're playing a note that's perfectly in tune, the octave is in tune. If you wanted to go into real detail on it, you could do it at other frets, like trying the 3rd fret and then jumping up to the 15th fret. Just checking that it's totally an octave each time. That's what the intonation is, checking the octaves. These saddles you can adjust individually. Some bridges, like a classic telly bridge, might be one saddle adjusting 2 strings at a time. I've just set the intonation on all 6 strings whilst in the playing position, and now the next stage is just to play each string at every fret, just to check that it's not choking out or there's no problems anywhere. Now, those problems might be caused by fret height, but what's most likely is it might be something to do with the string height or possibly the truss rod, which is why we've left the truss rod cover undone for now. Normally what I would do is play each string. I've actually set this up slightly wrong, deliberately to show you what I mean. So let's try the B string here. So you can hear here, it's choking out. I'm playing different frets, different notes, but basically getting the same sound where the string's hitting a higher fret. Now the reason for that is probably because the string is too low when I'm playing. The string action's too low. So what I would do now is double check my string height, which I know is wrong because I set it up wrong deliberately for this demo. And then I would come back and adjust the height again. So they need to be raised very slightly. There we go, it's playing fine. So I check all the strings like that. You might find that you're checking all the string height seems fine to you and you don't want to push the string height any higher, and then you can make a slight adjustment with the truss rod again. Once you make those adjustments, go back over, check the intonation, should all be fine. You're still having problems with fret buzz. It could be something to do with each fret having a slightly different height. Maybe they've been worn or not set up properly in the factory, and that would mean having to dress the frets and bring them, one of them down lower if it's catching. It could also be the break angle of the neck. So you see here where the neck hits the body, it's at a very slight angle. If that angle is wrong, it can affect the strings. Now, both adjusting the frets and adjusting the neck angle are much more complicated than a general setup, and I'll definitely be making further videos about them. You can put something called a shim in, which you might put in, unbolt the neck, put a little bit of wood here, very, very thin, then screw the neck back down, and it will make the angle very slightly higher because we're pushing the neck up here. So the angle will go from here to here, exaggerated there. Or you could put a shim in right at the back where it meets, and that will make the angle go more like this. Normally you'd have a shim at the back if your action was too high, and a shim at the front if you're finding a lot of buzzing happening. The last thing to set up is the pickups. So what I've done deliberately here on this bridge pickup is I've set one side of the pickup quite low and the other side so high it's touching the strings. Now obviously you don't want your pickup as high that it's touching the strings, but what you want to do in playing position is play your guitar a bit and make sure that the pickup isn't going to be so high that when you're strumming, etc., you're hitting the strings somehow. So I'm just going to lower this side. Again, once I've finished filming this, I'm actually going to do it in the playing position to double check this. But here we go. It might still be touching slightly there. Can lower it a bit. Now the pickup's still at a bit of an angle. What you want to make sure you do is not necessarily have it absolutely flat. You might need it at an angle because you want to make sure that the volume of your strings is more or less equal across. So here we go, playing the low E and the top E. Top E seems to me to be a bit quieter, so either I could raise this side or lower this side. I'm actually going to lower this one very slightly and raise this one very slightly, trying to get them to be equal. That seems a bit more equal to me. Of course, there may be a reason why you want your strings particularly louder on one side than the other for the way you're playing if you're doing something a bit different. Now, the other thing to check is between the two pickups. You want the pickups presumably to be a similar volume to each other. Again, it might be that you're using one pickup for example, playing lead, and not only do you want the different tone, but you actually want it physically louder. Now, as well as the volume controls, one way you could do that is by raising or lowering the bridge, the pickup height, but let's just have a look here. Bridge, neck. So it seems to me that maybe the neck is slightly louder. So actually I might raise this up a little bit more, the bridge. And the reason to do this in sitting positions, you can also play chords, you can go backwards and forwards easier, and you can play it as you actually would normally play. Oops, that's a bit, slipped a bit. Let's just check with this one. That seems roughly equal. Great, thanks for watching. I hope you found that as useful as I found it fun to make. Don't forget there are certain things about your setup which are going to be personal to you. The action that you have might change depending on the style you're playing, or even amongst a couple of different guitars that you own, you might have slightly different actions. Things like the intonation, however, they are set. You have to get the intonation perfect to keep your guitar in tune as you move along the fretboard. And to do that, the bridge is very important, which is why I've made a series of videos, and in fact I'm making more. I'm editing a Floyd Rose one at the moment. I'm making a series of videos which focus in on how each individual bridge works, so you can get the nuances for the bridge that is in your guitar. So do subscribe to see those videos as they come. Subscribe, hit the bell. People may have given some other tips that I haven't mentioned in here in the comments below, so do read through them to see if there's something that's useful, and leave a like to someone if they have left something that's helpful. If you've got some advice for other people, leave that there too. It's always great. I read through the comments, I leave messages. In fact, it was the regular comments about making a setup video that led me to make this. So you can follow me on other forms of social media. I think they're along a bar here. Also, I sell some merch through my Redbubble site. There's a mug. I've been wearing a t-shirt. And also, obviously, I customise guitars and I sell them through my website. You can get in contact if you've got an idea of something you want to make. In fact, I've got a whole video about how to commission a guitar from me. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this. Happy strumming.